So I'll just start with a little presentation, just for 3 or 4 slides. So as mentioned, this is going to be on Substance Painter and using it to work with Blender. It will be kind of four rough areas. I'll give a short introduction just to Substance Painter. I have a model set up in Blender that I will talk through that's ready for Substance Painter. I'll then import it, and I'll just do some fairly high level texturing, and then exporting and importing back into Blender. So Substance Designer is a program it's a specialized program only for painting, for painting your meshes, and you can also render your 3D meshes. So it's basically 3D painting software. There is a monthly license. It's not free. There's a monthly license you can get. It's either about $20 or $100. Or on the Steam store, you can actually buy it with a one-off payment. That's like about £120, and then you get that for lifetime, which is great. The only problem is when they release a new version, you don't get the latest version. You'll get the updates and everything up until the latest version is released, but the version that I'm using, I purchased through the Steam store. It's been working fine for me. I think it will last for at least 2 or 3 years, at least for my requirements. There isn't, unfortunately, there's no official add-on for Blender. They do have quite a few add-ons, as you can see in that image that I've inserted there. But at the moment, there isn't one for Blender. There are some unofficial add-ons, and I think one of the most popular is called LiveLink, which is not free as well. You have to pay. It's between $25 or $50 for LiveLink. I haven't used it myself, but it does look good. But saying that, I actually find Substance Painter pretty easy to use with Blender, so I'm not in any urgent need or rush to get an add-on to connect the two, because they're working fine without it at the moment. So I've set up a simple model in Blender, which I will go to in a second. I'll go into thus it's set up. I've got a high poly and a low poly version, and baking the high poly details. I'll talk about vertex IDs, texturing in Substance Painter, and then setting up the textures in Blender. So that covers just the initial introduction. And now I will just jump into Blender. So let me just jump into solid view. So I've got a pretty simple model set up. It's just a gravestone. So I've got a low poly version here, very simple. It's got about 40 faces. What I did was I then took this gravestone and then I sculpted this more stylized and maybe slightly more, possibly more realistic version. Maybe not that realistic, but stylized version. I did the edges and I did some cracks in it and so forth. I also used the text tool and wrote some text and then just joined them together. So if I just go into edit, you can see it's a very high poly mesh. It's 122,000 faces. So if you were going to use that in a video game, or possibly if for some reason you're going to animate it, then it would be very demanding on resources. And obviously it's mainly common in video games of taking the details from a high poly mesh and then baking them to a normal texture so you can put that on your low poly mesh. Doing that in Blender is a little bit laborious. You have to go through several steps to do it. It's once you've done it a few times you can pick it up, but it's not the easiest thing. But I'll demonstrate how it's done in Substance Painter, which is actually very easy to do. So before I export this into Substance Painter, I'll just go into the setup. So you have to make sure that the scale is all set to 1, so it's all even on all the axes. You know, you just Control A and you can reset the scale, and that sets it all to 1. So I've done that on both of the models. The origin point for the access control, I've also set to the same location on the models. That's when I've taken models into Substance Painter, and sometimes if these are different, like the baking of the details doesn't always work, so I've just set them to the same point. And also when I exported these models out, I also had them at the same world origin location as well. And that just makes sure that their origins are lined up and everything. So you do the scale, the origins, and the 2 final things. Next thing is the UV. So this low poly mesh, I did a simple unwrap for it, as you can see in the bottom left corner. I've just got the 2 main faces at the top and then the edges down at the bottom. Pretty straightforward. I marked the seam around the edges to do that. I didn't do like a smart UV project. Generally speaking, I will always try and do like a proper unwrap. It just makes it easier to texture the item when you've got like these nice faces aligned next to each other and so forth. So for this object, obviously I've done a UV unwrap. Saying that, I do smart UV project as well. It just depends on time constraints and how much care I'm going to put into the texturing. So I've got the UV set up, and the final thing that you can do, you don't have to do this, but it can be very useful, is this model, I've only got 1 material slot assigned to it. So it would be easy to wrap, for example, a stone texture around this model. But it's quite a simple model, so I don't need other material slots. But if I'm texturing in Substance Painter and I want to add textures maybe to different faces, and I want to do that in the easiest way possible, what you can do is go into, first select the face that you want to assign a vertex ID. So if you want a face that's going to have a specific texture, just select it. So I'll select the front face here, for example. And then when you've got that selected, just go into Vertex Paint. I've actually already painted this model or given it vertex colors, but I'll go through the process again. So up in the top left-hand corner, you can select a color. It can be any color you want, it doesn't matter. The only reason you'd pick different colors is if you were picking different faces and you wanted different IDs, different vertex IDs assigned to those faces. So I'll just pick like a blue color. And I'm going to press the mask button. So the only face that's showing is the face that I selected. And now I'm going to press Shift K, and then it fills that face with the vertex color. And I've already done it for the other faces. So it's just exactly the same process. Select a face and then assign it a vertex color. What I might quickly do is just go back into edit mode, select that face, back into vertex, and I'm going to give this back face a different color, so it's not a blue. Shift K, and now I've got different IDs assigned to different faces within this model. You don't have to do that, but it can make it a lot easier when you're texturing within Substance Painter. And obviously, again, I will show how that's done. So this is ready now. Export out is exactly the same way that you would export out any model. So just File, Export, and then and then export it out. I've exported these out already. I named the low poly at the end, I put LP, and then for the high poly, so I'll minimize that now and bring up Substance Painter. So this is a Substance Painter interface. I mean, like most 3D programs, it can be a bit tricky to pick up, but once you get going, it's fairly straightforward. It has quite a lot of similarities, or some similarities, with Photoshop, in the fact that when you bring in your model, all your texturing is done on layers, and the layers panel is here. All these panels you can move around, resize, stack them, and so forth. So you can completely change how this layout works to whatever you wish. The bottom is where all your assets and your textures and materials and meshes, sorry, not meshes, masks are kept. And the texture set list is the material slots that are assigned to your model. And I will show you what that means when I bring in the model now. So simply just go to new, start a new project. The shader template, you can just, for Blender, you can just stick with the default metallic roughness. I read is good for working with Blender. For file, so I'm just going to select file, and because I was practicing this before, it brings up the folder that I need instantly, and I'm going to select the low poly version. I'm just going to open that. In document resolution, I will select 4K, and that will make my textures 4K. When I come to export them, I can change the texture sizes at any time, so I'm not stuck with that. I won't go into the rest of this now, just due to time constraints, but this setup is fine. So I'm just going to click OK. And there's my low poly greystone. So on the left-hand side is the 3D view. On the right-hand side is the UV 2D view. And there in the texture set list is my one material slot. As described before, I've only given it one. You can, as you probably all know, give it multiple material slots, but for this type of model, one material slot is fine. So that, I mean, at a very high level, covers the UI. Maybe the one final thing I could mention here is that the camera button brings it into its ray tracing viewport, and it uses a ray tracing system called iRay. And this is where you can also do your renders and rendering if you wish. So I'm going to jump back into the texturing mode. And the first thing that you need to do after you've imported your model is you need to bake the mesh maps. This is so this is so Substance Painter knows exactly where to lay out all the faces, all the details, and all the masks that it creates. I can bake various channels. I'm going to remove metallic here because I don't need it, but these 4 channels here will work fine. You can add all types of other channels like displacement, opacity, reflection, and so forth, but these channels I've got will be just fine for this model. So I've selected that. Now I go down to bake mesh maps. I can choose a resolution, so I'm going to pick 4K. Dilation and diffusion, they basically they set the bleeding and how far the textures go over the UV edges. So when you set these, it makes sure that the texture will go right up to the edge of the UV map. Next is where I load up the high poly. So I'm going to click this button here, just click on my high poly mesh and load it in. and it's there. The settings for max frontal and max rear, I'm going to change to about 0.03, and all that does is it limits how far the ray tracing will search the high poly mesh for details that it will bake onto the low poly mesh. Everything else, well, I can turn the anti-aliasing to maybe 2x2 for this, and that just increases the quality of the texture, and I believe it smooths out the jagged edges. So that's that for this. To start with, I'm not going to bake a thickness because a thickness is for organic type materials such as skin or leaves, where you get the sun that can kind of, some of the light can shine through and you get that subsurface scattering. I won't bake the IDs yet, but I will bake everything else. So I'll bake that. And it shouldn't take too long. So as you can see, the details are being baked onto this low poly mesh. And it's a little bit more simpler as opposed to what you have to do in Blender. So just take a few more seconds. It's, I don't know why, for some reason, when I have a high poly mesh, I can't bake the IDs. So I'm going to go back in, I'm going to remove the high poly mesh, and I'm going to set the IDs. These are my vertex IDs. The color source is going to be the vertex color, and I'm just going to bake my vertex IDs. So that's done there. And now this is ready to be textured. So I'll go back into my texture set and layers panel. The first thing that I would do when texturing a model is start with a base color. In this example, I'm going to use a smart material. And smart materials are basically groups of or layers of different textures that are all saved together, and they apply, you know, various effects or various looks. So I'm going to do a search for rock, and this is one that I created. It's very easy to create new smart materials. You just group all your layers into a folder and then just save as a smart material. And all I'm going to do is just drag it onto the gravestone. And as you can see, it's done a fairly good job just straight off. I'm just going to move the position of the sun a bit. So it's looking like a very kind of weathered old gravestone. The seam is quite obvious though. That's probably the only issue there, but that's easy to fix with Substance Painter. So I'm going to go into the layer. I'm going to click on the fill, because this is basically a fill layer. It's just covered it with a stone texture. I'm going to go down to projection, and I'm going to go to triplanar projection. And I'm going to also reduce the hardness down to 0, and that just blends the edges of where the faces meet. And now the seam has really been hidden. I can also move this up and down, see if I can find a better kind of blend, but it does a pretty good job. I think that's okay for now. So that's that setup. The next thing I'll do is I'm going to go back into Smart Materials, and where I mentioned before about vertex IDs. So with this model, I've got these different IDs assigned, as you can see here. I'm going to just go back to the material layer, and to use those, there's different ways I can use them, but with a smart material, I can select one, and press Control, and then I can just drag it up, and then it will give me the different IDs of where I can drop it. So I can just drop it onto the front, and then it will just load up that material on the front and only on the vertex ID that I selected. And it's easy because this is all layered. It's very easy just to turn it on and off, or just delete it if I want to. So, I mean, you probably wouldn't use vertex IDs for a simple model like this, but if you're doing a car or a house that's got more details, then they can be very useful. So that's the vertex IDs. Another way to do vertex IDs is if you just drag a material over the object, see that's covering everything. If I go to the folder and I right click, and then I add mask with color selection, and then I select the color picker, and then I just select again any of the IDs, it'll only add that material to that ID. And when these textures are exported, that will be baked all onto one texture. So it's just nice one texture that can be easily plugged in. Now the next thing I will do is, as this is a gravestone that's quite weathered, it would be, I think, appropriate that the edges are a little bit more worn. So with this layer here, I'm just going to right click, and there's various options. I can add a mask, there's different masking options. I can add a generator, a paint, a fill, a level, a filter, or an anchor point. But what I want here is a generator. And generators, they create like procedural effects. I think is a kind of high level summary of what they do. But it's given me the option, or you always have the option of doing it on the different channels, but I only want this on the color channel. So I'm going to turn off height, roughness, and normal. And I'm going to go into generator, and I'm going to select the mask editor. Now, as you can see, that's already defining the edges quite nicely. Obviously, I don't want that color, but the edges is working very nicely there. So to get the color back, I'm just going to change the blending mode. And I found when I was practicing that soft light was working quite well with this. And so I changed it to soft light, and I'm going to reduce its strength by about, I don't know, 50%. And then I'm going to go into the mask editor options, and on global contrast, I'm just going to bring up global contrast slowly. And then it just automatically just finds those edges. I mean, I can bring it right up, but obviously that's too much. So I bring it down, and it just defines those edges really nicely. There's other settings here, like I can blur the edges a bit as well. But I think that's working pretty well. Well, I might turn it up a bit more. So that's the edges done. So you can see that's really actually quite straightforward. I'm going to put them into a folder. I just like to keep things organized. Or let me just change it to soft light. So you can see that's pretty straightforward. Obviously, there's so many different options. I'm only going to be able to cover a few, but you can just keep on going with detail as much as you like, and stacking the layers on top of each other and blending them. I'll do one other thing here, and that's what I will do is I'm going to create another layer here, and I'm going to call this height. Because like this gravestone has got no detail on the front at all. I mean, the detail that was with the model is actually there. It's very kind of hidden. It hasn't come out that well here. I could keep that, but I would probably, if I was doing this for a project or something, I'd probably just delete that from the model and then just use a height texture to bring in the text. And to use a height texture, all I've done is added another layer. I'm gonna go into my alphas and select one of these alpha patterns. Oh, sorry, before I do that, I do need to just go into my layer settings, scroll down, and then turn off color, roughness, and normal. So only height is on. And then with the height slider, I can go up to 1, which kind of like extrudes the details, or I can go to -1, which like indents the details. So, but I want to indent them in this case. I've got my alpha selected, and I am just going to increase its size. That's Control right button. And then all I need to do is just press it once, and then it just gives that illusion of a carving on the gravestone. I'm going to select another alpha, maybe this one here, change its size, and I'm just going to put that there. And then earlier today, I created an alpha. It was very easy, just in Photoshop, white text on a black background. So I'll select that, and I'm going to put that in the middle, about there. So there I've got some detail on the gravestone. Because I think that looks a little bit too crisp, I'm just going to right click on the height, and I'm going to add a filter. I only want the height channel selected, and I'm just going to add a blur. And I'm just going to blur that a little bit. So it's it looks like it's blended in a bit more. Something like that. Maybe I can reduce that. Okay. Because I'm running a little bit short on time, I will, let's see, I will export the textures out now and show you. It's very, very straightforward to set them up in Blender. So to export the textures out, I go to File, Export Textures. Make sure that I've got the right folder selected. I'm going to create a new folder because I was practicing earlier. So I'm going to call this Grave 6. And then I've just got this folder selected. There, those settings I can keep as they are. Saying that, the output template, I have set one up for Blender Cycles. The only change that I've made, or that I found, or some of the tutorials that I've done, you've got all these output templates. It gives you a wide range of options. In my Blender template, in the normal map, I've changed it from DirectX to OpenGL. It was one of the tutorials I did, said that that's the best option for normals. But apart from that, it's pretty much a default setting. So I'm going to export that out. It doesn't take very long. I've exported that out at 4K, but if I wanted to, I could do 1K, I could do 8K, you know, a wide range of resolutions there. So I'm going to cancel that, and I'm going to go back into Blender. And now I'm going to go into Cycles, and with the shader panel selected, I'm going to select the principled shader, and I'm going to press Control-Shift-T. I'm going to go into my folder, and then I'm going to select all these materials, and I'm going to click on Principled Textured Set, and it will create a texture set for me, and which is something I found out quite recently, which is extremely useful. So that's all set up. And as you can see, all the detail is there from Blender. That is still the low poly mesh. So I'll just jump back. That's a low poly mesh that's taken all the details from this high poly, but in this lovely low poly model. If I just change, maybe I'll change the atmosphere a bit. Where is it? Is it this one? Might give you a different view. I'm just changing the sun. That's not doing that much. So there's one further thing I can do here before I stop. If I go back into Substance Painter, now imagine that, I don't know, you're working with a client or you're working on your own personal project and you want to really quickly change the textures. For example, if for some reason the grave had to be wooden, I'm just going to use a smart material. I'm just going to drop it onto the top. So now I've got a wooden grave, which has changed. All I need to do is go to File, Export Textures. Now I could select a new folder to export them to, but I'm going to keep this same folder because this is like my project folder that I'm working with for this model. And I can always export out the old textures again if I want to. So I'm just going to hit export. That'll take a few seconds. Obviously, I can turn this layer off. I can go back and export my old textures out, or I can turn it on again. You know, it's completely flexible, non-destructive layers there. So I'm going to go back into Blender, and I just need to refresh the viewport. So I'm going to go into Solid and then back into Cycles. And it's changed it to this wood texture. The reason it just did that automatically is because those textures went into the same folder. It's replaced them, but it's just a really quick way of updating your textures. So if you were tweaking a texture or you were maybe making some minor changes, you could just do that in the same way. And that's it. That was fairly high level. Hopefully, I've covered some key points there, especially if you're interested in looking further into Substance Painter. Personally, I found it a very useful program. And if I do any more advanced texturing, I always use Substance Painter now. I kind of stopped using Blender, especially when I'm baking textures or anything like that. Substance Painter does make it a lot easier. I also think there's probably one area that Blender, if it could improve on, is its baking, and some areas of its texturing would be really great. But Substance Painter is a great tool to